Willkommen zu Zeitgeist, the podcast and blog for all things German, from history and politics to books and even sausages. I'm your host, Katja Heuer, and I have a very special guest with me today, Sabine Rennefanz. Sabine is a German journalist and author. Like me, she was born in what was then East Germany. And like me, she has since moved away from there, from her home region, living and working in places like Berlin, Hamburg, and London. She writes for the Berlin paper Tagesspiegel and has her own column in the political magazine Der Spiegel, talking about her latest novel Kosakenberg and all sorts of other things to do with East Germany. We're going to try and discuss whether there's still an East German identity today, what it actually means to be from East Germany nearly 34 years now, after the 35 years even, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And basically what this means for Germany and the country today as well. So no pressure at all, Sabine. Welcome to Zeitgeist.
Hello, very happy to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Before we get to your latest book, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood in East Germany? How old were you when the Berlin Wall fell? Where did you grow up, and what was it like?
So I was 15 when the wall fell, and I was at a boarding school, which is a bit unusual in the GDR times, in a small industrial town called Eisen So one of these steelwork towns, like a steelwork basically, and a town built around it, and it was called Stalinstadt in the 50s. It has a very interesting history, and I was a student there, in ninth grade.
And how did your life change once the Berlin Wall fell? So you'd experienced a little bit of East Germany basically during your childhood and your early sort of teenage years, and then suddenly everything changed, I imagine, or what was it like for you?
Yeah, it was a complete upheaval, and the in how enormous it was, it only became clear basically in the years afterwards, and how much also the GDR has shaped me, the experience. So I was being 15, it's like a difficult time anyway. You're sort of trying to get a bit more independent, become your own personality, but also you still sort of, need this sort of orientation or like connection with your parents and other adults, and all this sort of, I mean, when the wall fell, first of all, in Eisenhüttenstadt, no one knew anything. On the 9th of November, famously, we were sleeping. There were no iPhones in our pockets. There were no phones. And only the next day we learned, okay, the wall is open. And then the first half year afterwards was like an enormous excitement, like the freedom, the possibilities. But then it all very much changed and during 1990, it became clear that the future was very much insecure. Like it wasn't sure if this special school, which was like a language school, if it would continue, if we could do A levels, teachers would disappear without any warning. It was like, by hindsight, really quite chaotic. And then my father would lose his work in 1990 when it was clear that there would be like the fiscal union between the two Germans. So after this excitement made way to a lot of like more sort of darker and more complicated feelings, so to say. So it was really probably the most important thing that happened in my life so far.
And that's also the subject of your first book, Eisen Kinder, or Iron Children, I suppose you could translate it, which is an allusion to, as you say, the city that you grew up in, or the town that you grew up in, Eisenhüttenstadt. So in that book, you describe to some extent the sort of anger and disorientation that people of your generation, so young people, basically people who were in their teenage years when the Berlin Wall fell, felt. And it seems to me that the book did sort of, strike a nerve with other people who felt the same way. It was very widely read, and there seems to have been a very strong sort of response to it from your readers. Other readers got quite angry about it, and there was a sort of debate around that, and people were sort of saying, well, you can't speak for an entire generation. Why do you think the book struck such a nerve with people one way or another? So what was it that it was trying to get to the bottom to that other people also have very strong feelings about?
So the book came out in 2013, so 11 years ago, and that was a very different time from now. So basically, the common mood was in the West German dominated media that the conflict between East and West is over. There's no problem. The unification, great, it was a fantastic story, best thing that ever happened. And at the same time, there was a lot of anger and disconnect in amongst East Germans, but it wasn't really heard because, as you know, but maybe your listeners don't know, the sort of media is very much dominated by West German companies. So there were very little East German voices, and it was not cool to be talking about East Germany. So, but then there a lot of things had happened, and I came out with this book and. Which was on the background that there was maybe I have time to tell this that these three neo-Nazis were found out they were running around through Germany killing migrants, and for a long time they were not seen, and the murders were belittled by the authorities and by the police as so-called Döner murders, so-called like kebab murders, if you would translate that maybe. So, and these guys, when they found out, they were like my generation, they were also 14, 15 when the wall came down, and that they had a very similar upbringing. They came from similar towns, and that sort of sparked my thinking. And I didn't have like a neo-Nazi past or so, but I had also like a sort of little bit radical tendencies and a lot of anger. And I wrote about that. And then I think even my publisher was kind of surprised how much people felt that I'm describing something, this anger that other people felt but hadn't had the words to express it. And it was the first time, or one of the first times, that not the GDR was looked at, but the consequences of the transformation afterwards. So beforehand, the idea was, there was the fall of the wall and everyone was dancing happily ever after, freedom, yeah. But it wasn't like that. It was democracy in East Germany came with a lot of problems like deindustrialization, loss of work, loss of income, insecurities, and also like a political feeling of not having any power. And I was one of the first people who expressed that and try to explain that for a certain group. And yeah, I mean, I still get people like at readings, even at my readings for Kosakenberg, people come up and say, either, yeah, we love that book, you expressed our feelings, or people say, oh, we hated that book. And like the other day, a teacher from my old school came up and said, oh yeah, you put us on spot there, even with our real names, and you attacked us. Well, I didn't attack them. I just said that they were not there for us. The teachers completely either physically or mentally disappeared because they were so busy with their own life and finding their footing. I mean, it's explainable, but I'm just saying how it was. And all these people had also, I mean, it's a non-fiction book, so everything was authorized, all the names, and you have to go through a long-winded legal process. So, but I mean, 11 years on, it still sort of, yeah, resonates. That sort of also surprises me. It was my first book, and when a book comes out, you never know what happens. So
yeah, I know the feeling with the controversy sparked around East German books, that they certainly still seem to hit into a sort of climate where it's difficult to talk about East Germany without creating some sort of emotional response to it. You already mentioned, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, with what happened with your book was basically with Beyond the Wall, the book about the GDR history was like sort of, I mean, that was like on a sort of more bigger level. I mean, like, and the debate like 11 years ago was a bit smaller and it wasn't like so big, and the attacks weren't also so big, but you had what I experienced like amplified.
Yeah, and I think it's because that was the entire history of the GDR that I'm effectively trying to capture, and like with you,
exactly.
people either feel it does or it doesn't fit what they think. One of the, I think, cliches maybe that people have about this immediate period after the wall fell is this right-wing extremism that you just hinted at as well. So you in particular in your work, you talked about a man called Uwe Mundlos, who is basically a, you know, as you mentioned, a right-wing, not just right-wing, a neo-Nazi, and a terrorist
basically, yeah.
From a group called the National Socialist Underground, or NSU. To what extent do you think that is actually typical for the generation? So you do talk about, or you have just talked about, the fact that this kind of confusion, the anger and so on is to a degree. But this idea that the entire sort of East turned radical, is there anything to that, do you think?
I mean, this radicalization of Uwe Mundlos and his friends is extreme. But I would say the anger that is like on the way is like a more widespread phenomenon. So it's an extreme, it's like, and for me it was important to explain that this political, that kids being shoved into radical ideologies it's not the GDR's fault, or not entirely the GDR's fault. It's because what happened in the years after 1990, during the years of the transformation, the complete political and also psychological neglect of this generation has had like really problematic consequences. That was basically my point I was making. I'm not saying that everyone became a neo-Nazi. It's like a sort of fine line to treat, also because I wanted to say, okay, we have a problem in East Germany with neo-Nazis, but it's not for the reason you think, and it's not that we only have these problems because of the GDR and that the West Germany doesn't have these problems. In both sides of Germany, we have problems, but we have them for different reasons, and we have to look at what the reasons are and what has gone wrong in the 90s.
And your latest novel, Kosakenberg, kind of almost takes that a step forward. So the protagonist is a young East German woman who is basically in her 30s. So it's almost like you know, you're kind of still looking at that generation, but a little bit later in time, if you will. And she decides to move away from her East German village in rural, what was rural East Germany, and she moves to London. But somehow the village of Kosakenberg doesn't really let her go, if you will. So she constantly returns to it whenever there's any kind of occasions like birthdays, Christmas, and so on. And so the village kind of looms over her life still, even though she's in London and working over there. I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but since you also worked in London for a time and you also still think about East Germany, did you really write about yourself, or how fictional is this book that you've just published?
Yeah, that's a favorite question of all writers.
So I thought I'd ask it too.
Yeah, it's not an autobiography. It's a mixture of like many influences, and I mean, it's I could have written an autobiography, but I chose to write a novel with a protagonist called Kathleen, to pronounce it in a German way, Kathleen, as she calls herself when she lives in London, because I didn't want to write another non-fiction book on this topic, because I wanted to explore more the feelings. It's basically a family story. It's a story about loss and home, and I think it's like a universal or female story, maybe coming of age story of emancipation that just happens to take place in East Germany, because that's what I know best. I mean, I could have written about something else, but I mean, I stick to my guns, because just writing about the things I know best. But I would say that this character Kathleen is most removed from me than from my I mean, it's not the first person narrator like an Eisen Kinder, so to say. And the influences were, I mean, of course I have similar thoughts, or I think about similar topics as Kathleen, but also other people's lives, people experiences come in, observations. And I've been sort of thinking so long, for such a long time, about this, that so many people have left East Germany after 1991. I mean, you also left like a little bit younger, but like 4 million people between 1991 and 2017. I mean, that's enormous. I think it's almost like I mean, almost a unique thing in the world wide scale, if you don't have people fleeing from a war, or so, from a war zone. So I was always like, what does this do, like this going away with the people who have stayed? That was like something I wanted to explore, and the difficult questions also of leaving your class. This French writer Didier Eribon was very important for me. What that does also to the interpersonal relationships, the relationship to the mother is very important, to her childhood friend. And yeah, and I also think like this village life. I started writing when my daughter was very small. She was just born in 2017, and she I looked at her and I thought she will never know the village that I knew, like with the eggs and everything. Eggs, maybe we can talk about the eggs later. But so much has changed in village life, as it has actually in Britain in the last 40, 50 years, that I wanted to preserve these sort of massive changes, basically. And I was at a reading the other day, and there was an English woman, and she got up afterwards, and she comes from some village in the south west, and she said, yeah, I have exactly similar experiences with my family as Kathleen. That's really really crazy. So yeah, it's not just an East German story.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it made me think about basically how many people this applies to as well. When I was reading it, I recognized a lot of what you said in my own experiences, kind of going back and forth between a world that I left behind, and my life in the UK is also very different compared to the people who stayed behind. And at some point, your character says something like, "We," when we come back, speaking effectively for this huge group that you just mentioned of millions of people who've left sort of East Germany in this case, but in general kind of their home behind and moved somewhere else. One of the issues I would say that is quite typical though for East Germans in particular when they move abroad is this idea of speaking English with confidence and speaking it as if it was normal. So your character goes to London and she meets other Germans there and is a bit sort of taken aback by the way that they seem to sort of switch seamlessly from German into flawless English and back again without a second thought about it. And you and I both learned English, I would imagine, from English teachers who had never been to an English-speaking country, so that even still applies to my generation as well. You said it's obviously not not an autobiographical novel, but how did you find that process? I mean, you obviously speak English very well now. You lived in London as well. I would imagine actually when I left school, my Russian was probably better than my English because my Russian teacher was very good and very enthusiastic, and she'd lived in Russia for some time. And I then had to actively go about, improving my own English by reading Harry Potter, for example. I sat there with the book and then the dictionary on the other side and tried to sort of improve my English. How did you do that, and how did you find that process?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, also that we speak in English now with each other. For me, I don't know. For me, it's also probably not so unusual because I'm married to a British guy and we speak English at home, so it doesn't yet feel so unusual to speak. Plus, we live in Berlin. I mean, English is basically Berlin's first language now, even in the sort of more suburb area where we live. It has really really changed. So yeah, but still, it's funny that we converse in English. How did I do that? I found the other day when I was tidying up a little book with vocabulary, so that I must have had when I first arrived in London in 2001, and I think I started like putting all the words I don't know from reading The Guardian, also in this book, and then translating it. I was terrified when I arrived. I arrived there with a backpack and had to find a flat. And in the evening, I stayed in a hotel. I switched on the TV, and I was terrified. I hardly understood anything. And I was at the language school, but as you said, my teacher had never been to to an English-speaking country. I mean, I did A levels in 1993, so even less possibilities also for these teachers. And I was terrified. Like, what have I gotten myself into? And I was a correspondent for a newspaper, and I had to report on this. I mean, the Iraq War had just sort of happened, and I had to report on British politics. It was really, really scary, and I was like, really, I was watching the BBC. I was sitting there with dictionaries. I was really making frantically English friends, like really harassing people to meet up with me, basically. And it's not easy, as you know. So I found, yeah, you know, sort of this sort of cool. I didn't want to meet any Germans, just sort of British people and speaking. And yeah, I also tried I also read Harry Potter, but mainly more I was more watching TV and listening to the radio, because I found actually the speaking, to understand the speaking and to get also this lingo, when you make a call at the Foreign Office. Also, I mean, I was a journalist, right? And I was so hugely helped when I found this office with other British journalists, like a co-working space, one would say now. And I could just listen when they were on the phone, you know, how they would do it, and all these sort of little things, these little niceties that we don't do in Germany. The sound of the voice to sort of aping this, like, sort of Oxford English. I mean, I'm not. I mean, some Germans are really much better at it, like you, but I sort of, yeah, I really had to learn fast. It was terrifying. I only probably could do it because I was younger.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I moved to Singapore, was my first sort of foreign country that I lived in, and
Why
found
Singapore? How did that happen?
I just had to get away, and that seemed a good place. It was far away and
It's very
different.
far away.
But there were lots of Germans there. They kind of seemed to very seamlessly, also mostly West Germans, sort of switch back and forth between English and German. And I found that absolutely terrifying, because they did it with such ease, you know, and you're kind of constantly thinking about your own words and how to say things. And as you say, in school, you don't learn, you know, how you actually interact basically in the other language, how you say things, what isn't appropriate, and those sorts of things. And especially as a German, you can come across as, you know, very direct and very abrupt
Yeah,
unless you kind of know how to say things. Another thing I found interesting, culturally speaking, both in your book, and I'm sure you've come across this in your own life as well, is that when you meet East Germans outside of East Germany, so be that in West Germany or abroad, they often don't really make a big thing out of their origins. They either, you know, they learn sort of High German, for lack of a better word, so standard German. They try not to speak in their local dialect or accent, and quite often they don't really say basically where they're from, so that they fit into this world that they encounter there. Have you found that as well, or have you ever done that for that matter? So did you try and sort of shake off the sort of Berlin Brandenburg accent that I'm sure you spoke as well as a kid? I did, and then found it quite difficult to learn how to speak sort of proper German, if you will, standard German, and to try and not constantly draw attention to where I was from.
yeah, I'm guilty of that as well, especially in the 90s when I lived in Hamburg. I even remember not saying, I actually even lied about my origins. I said that I was from Bremen, because no one ever knew, no one, I mean, it's a sort of completely innocent town, no one cares, boring town, no one cares about it. So you know, that was finished. I said, people said, "Where are you from?" From Bremen. Yeah, conversation over. No one wanted to know anything about that. And then later, when I was at university in Hamburg, I said I was from Berlin, and in a sort of very confident way, just not to speak about it, because I had made these experiences when I said that I was from Brandenburg. First of all, people don't know where that was. People were like, oh, so you don't, why don't you speak with a Saxon accent? Saxony is a different federal state. It's like sort of asking someone from Cornwall, why doesn't this person speak in a Geordie accent? And so completely, yeah, unknowledgeable, and also like immediately all these questions. So, have your parents been in the Stasi? Were you hungry? Did you starve? Like tons of sort of questions, putting you sort of in this position that you have to justify for your being, like you were sort of looked at suspiciously, and you don't, I mean, with 19, 20, you're not so sure of yourself, you don't want that. Now, I mean, I don't care, I'm almost 50, so it's different, but in those times, yeah, I sort of changed to this proper standard German. But in England, and maybe that is also interesting for you, I mean, I had to go as a correspondent often to the embassy, and I thought I was the only East German there at the receptions or events, election watching, background talks with the ambassador, all these kind of things that you're being attended to. So I went there on a fairly regular basis, never met any East German. And yeah, there were all these people from all these institutions that I never heard about. I remember there was a guy from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is like a political trust by the Social Democratic Party, right? And I mean, I work with them a lot today, and I had never in 2001, I had never heard about the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung before. So I said, like, what is this? And he said, yeah, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And I mean, it was like sort of, I was from a completely different world, working class kid, just managed it somehow through university, and like had a sort of wild childhood distributing Bibles in Russia. And I was like, I was like, I didn't know. And then later I found out that the second spokesperson in the embassy, she was from Saxony, actually. And we only found that out after she quit the job and moved to Berlin with her British husband. So, but she had never given any inkling. I mean, we had a lot of dealings with each other, never given any inkling.
So you were both like sort of secret East Germans
abroad. East Germans. I don't think that would happen nowadays.
No, I mean, I met the deputy ambassador pretty soon after he started here, and the first thing he said to me is, I'm from Thuringia, but I think that's because, which is also an East German state, I think that is because my book had just come out as well, and he'd sort of, wanted to strike a connection there and talk about it, to say that he was also from there. I'm not sure that would have been the first thing that he said, and there's certainly nothing in his accents or in the way that he is that would indicate that as well. But wait a minute, you can't just say that you distributed Bibles in Russia as a child and leave that sitting there. You happy to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that is basically what my sort of radical path was, what I describe in my book, Eisen Kinder. And yeah, I got into this. I was like really confused, as I indicated, when the wall came down, and I got into this radical evangelist group in Hamburg, and I was sort of, yeah, in this like really strict, like long skirts, what's the word, like you're going on a mission, there's a proper word for it, a difficult word, like sort of distributing Bibles and stuff on the campus. And then I went on this mission in Russia, like north of St. Petersburg, for like half a year. Yeah, that was
as one does. That's quite a transition coming from atheist East Germany. That's quite a transition coming from atheist East Germany.
It is quite a transition, but it's sort of something appealed from this, like it was like I needed another radical, very rule-based group. And also being from East Germany didn't matter then. It did only mattered how much dedicated you were to Jesus. And So I felt this sort of set of very strict rules, and also it was interesting. It interests me by hindsight that I chose to go to Russia and not. I could have gone as a missionary to other places, but I chose to go to Russia. And yeah, it also, I mean, that was a terrible time in Russia. It was just after the Yeltsin reforms, this shock therapy. So people were properly starving, and that also sort of changed my view on Germany a bit and on my own life. And sort of then I had just to finish it, I had a love affair with a non-Christian, with an outsider, and then I got kicked out of that group. So thankfully.
And you just said that one of the things that appealed was that it didn't really matter where you were from. Do you feel that when East Germans go abroad to other countries, to what extent does their East Germanness still matter, or do you think it just dissolves into a wider kind of "I'm from Germany" identity?
Well, in my experience, going abroad for me is always easier than being in Germany and East German. I mean, going abroad, going to Amsterdam or London or Paris or whatever, being East German is always a less controversial or tricky, less tricky experience than going, for example, to Bonn or to Hamburg or Hanover and saying you're East German. I find it much easier to talk abroad about my experience, also the problems in East Germany right now, because I find there's a bigger interest, more openness, not this sort of in East Germany, the Cold War still lingers in the people's mind, even that it has finished, because West Germans still tend to have this tendency. They want to win. They want to show, yeah, but we won. We won. So why aren't you happy? Why aren't you happy and thankful? We rescued you. And this sort of strange couples dynamic, maybe like in a sort of really difficult marriage. Also, this outside of Germany, this doesn't happen. So I always have, like, I go to Cornwall. It's where my husband's family is from, and there in the bookshop you see the German writers books from like Jenny Appenberg, Brigitte Reimann, and I have conversations there about these writers. This would never happen in Bonn, you know. This is such a weird thing, actually. It's sort of that East Germany seems to be more popular outside of Germany.
Yeah, I've found that as well. It's certainly easier to talk about. I was recently in Frankfurt am Main, so the the West German Frankfurt, and talked to a group there called Diaspora Ost or Diaspora East, which made me wonder whether that's a thing. So do East Germans who are in West Germany for some, I don't know if you know this or if you've had any experiences with it, but is there a feeling that when you meet East Germans somewhere else that there is a particular affinity towards them, or do you not get that at all and they're just like other Germans to you?
So what is this Diaspora Ost? So there are people, they have like they have found their
It's
German
it's a group of East Germans in Frankfurt at university, basically, who want to talk
students.
about East Germany. There's, well, students, and also some of them are a little bit older. There's West Germans, interestingly, in that group as well, who are interested in East Germany for other reasons, for academic reasons mostly. But it's kind of like an interest group. I don't know if it's typical or not. It just made me think how when I meet East Germans in London sometimes at talks or other things, they usually come up to me and want to talk about East Germany. Was to me is always a bit confusing, but maybe I've just become too anglicized for that. I don't know. Do you feel when you meet East Germans somewhere else, do you feel any particular affinity towards them? Is it different to meeting other Germans, do you feel, or is that just not a thing?
One, it's sometimes it depends. I mean, it's I mean East Germans are also like 17 million, and they're very different people. There are some people who don't want to talk about it at all, and you very clearly on you get that feeling. I mean, it's probably very sort of polarized. Either they don't want to talk about it at all, or there's nothing else they want to talk about. So it's hardly any middle ground. But when I'm going around, like, usually I find it easier also with my new book, Kosakenberg. It's a bit easier to talk about it with East Germans, and it's a bit, you get quicker to a deeper topics because you have like a similar lingo. But yeah, I mean, I was in Bonn the other day because there was a celebration of 75 years of the Basic Law, Grundgesetz, the German Constitution, and there were no East Germans in Bonn, obviously. And the people were, I was talking that I find the whole celebration ridiculous because no democratic experiences of East Germany are mentioned. And I was retelling the story of the unification and what went wrong and why this is a problem for today. So my usual sort of spiel. And people were absolutely shocked. They were like, they were saying they were coming, and I thought they would be really angry at me and say, yeah, but why are you happy? And it was very different from what I expected because people were coming up really shocked and a bit maybe ashamed, saying, we didn't know that. We didn't know that. It's probably not true that they didn't know that. They just forgotten that they know and they didn't care. But they were really open and interested, and it was a different kind of atmosphere to talk. And I thought, okay, maybe it's moving, but it's more, it's different to talk with East Germans and West Germans about East Germany. There's still a difference. And I've noticed as well, I mean, maybe this is something that younger people do a bit. I mean, when I was in London, there was no sort of East German meeting group and pubs also. But I noticed younger people have sort of there's this whole sort of third generation East movement, and they have groups at universities and so on. I'm not, after this Christian group experience, I'm not so much one for groups. That just might be a personal thing, but yeah, it seemed to be a thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I'm not sure that people do it on purpose always, all the time, in like the West German media and things. They just often forget to tell the side story of what is to them a side story of the GDR. As well, I know the sort of other big bestseller last year, Doug Oschmann's book, he often complains about that as well, and basically says that the GDR history is still not part of German history. So there were celebrations, for example, the other day of the abolition of the law that made homosexuality illegal, and that was, of course, abolished much earlier in East Germany. And so when you celebrate on an all German radio channel today that this law was abolished at a certain point, could you not at least mention the fact that East Germany abolished it at a different point much earlier, as the case is in this case, and talk about that as part of the German story of German homosexuals as well, because they count there in the East. So I think you're right, there's this kind of consciousness that just isn't there, whilst somebody from the East would have picked that up, basically. So going back to your book, Kosakenberg, Kathleen becomes, as you call it, verengländert, so basically anglicized to some degree, and then every time she goes back, people notice that she's changed, or she's become sort of different, if you will. Did this happen to you as well? I mean, you're obviously very culturally adapted to England, not least because you lived here, but also because you're married to an Englishman. And if that happened to you, how did your friends and family from sort of Eisenhüttenstadt and your childhood respond to that? Did they notice that you're changing, and was that a good or a bad thing in their eyes?
Well, I think my protagonist, for her, is also extreme because she goes into this design and fashion magazine and is an art director there, which is like very different from the background that she has. Her father was a worker. Her mum was working with the post office. So she finds it very hard to talk about it and to find the words to speak about it. And they have like a lot of misunderstandings. And I painted maybe a little bit extreme, but in this book, I didn't have that extreme experiences. But yeah, it's what sort of strikes me most is that you sort of leave and your horizon becomes bigger, and bigger, and you meet all these different people, and you come back, and then you're still often the sort of child, and the people there, their horizon doesn't have changed so much, it seems, and there's often a lack of interest, and Kathleen suffers very much that no one is interested in the things that she's experiencing, and that is something that I experienced myself, but heard from many other people, that they get home and they never get any questions. Then their parents, family never want to know anything, um, because this world is so far away, and there doesn't seem to be like a connection, and also these difficult feelings, and I try to explore them in this book, this feeling of betrayal of the people who have left, and also, I don't know if you had this, but like in many working class families is this very strong sense of pride, but also the suspicion of moving up, like aha, so you feel better than us, you are someone better now, you use all these fancy words, you wear this expensive clothes, you travel around, you think you're better than us. So there's a conflict, and yeah, I mean, that's something that I also experience, and still experience. I mean, none of my family is going to read that book. They haven't read any of my books. So the only person reading my books was my mum, and she died. So yeah, that's that.
And is that something that bothers you? Would you like them to take more of an interest in the work, or do you feel that that is something that they couldn't, like culturally, for example, access in a way
I,
that you meant it in any case?
I find it painful. I mean, it's a lot of pain involved. It's a lot of pain in this sort of don't know if you also have that this feeling of like betrayal. I mean, you're here in Germany, you also get that often told, like, yeah, the situation in Germany is so dire, and the AfD is so strong because you left. That is something that one often gets. So if you hadn't left, then everything would be better. So the woman's fault. Um, yeah, I would of course have a like more interest in my work or in my world, but I also understand that, especially with this book, because so many people have told me who live in completely different circumstances, that is, some people are curious and others aren't, and but it's still a like painful experience, and I would have it would be nice to have more interest. On the other hand, I understand that this life in London, for example, is for people is like a different universe, is so far away, and this sort of yeah, writing, speaking, reading. I mean, there was a lot of, I mean, East Germany was a working class country, and there were intellectuals, but I don't come from that area. So there's also a lot of suspicion of people who, yeah, don't work with their hands, for example, in my family. Yeah, sort of the proper people are like the ones who work with hands. I'm sort of clumsy. But like, I sort of, the older I got, I sort of learned also to live with that. And I understand that there are some connections not
Yeah,
made.
and there's almost a degree of wandering between those worlds, isn't there? Where because when you come from them, you still understand to a degree, although things changed, of course, at home, if you will, as well. But you still kind of understand
Yeah,
that world, whilst you've moved away and got to know a new world that people from home, if you will, haven't experienced. And we should maybe also say for listeners, it's particularly a large group of women, basically young women that left, and that's often a fact that people aren't entirely aware of. I think how
mm,
much of a demographic and also cultural difference that's made, and there is, as you say, a degree of a reproach towards these women. You left, you went away, instead of changing something at home, basically, that there's that sort of, yeah, idea that you're partially responsible for what happened. in East Germany as well. Your character gets sent these famous eggs that are also on the cover of your book in London by her mother. What were you trying to sort of, yeah, what's the idea behind those eggs? So she's sitting in London and a parcel arrives, and she opens it up, and there's a sort of, packet of eggs in that
Raw eggs,
parcel
yeah.
sent by her mother.
Yeah, the raw eggs, everything starts with the eggs. And the eggs were like I've heard, I mean, this resonates so much. I've heard so many egg stories since then. It seems like the eggs were like a currency in the village, like people paid with eggs in the GDR time. Everyone had chicken, had eggs, and it was like a normal thing. And also when the daughters and sons started to leave for their university, like going to West Germany, were always given a package of eggs from the own chicken slot. And yeah, I was also given eggs by my mother and my grandmother, and I was actually sent a parcel of eggs to Islington, and I sort of kept going back to why these eggs, why always these eggs, and these eggs seem to trigger they seem to carry so much more meaning than just being nourishments, than just being eggs. They seem to have all this meaning of like trying to get a connection, trying to get yeah, preserving some sort of connection between tradition and the new world where the children that left live. And Kathleen, my protagonist, she thinks about that a lot, and what the eggs mean, and the eggs follow her, and the eggs also trigger this memory. And also, of course, the eggs is a symbol of fertility, and there are not enough children born in East Germany because the women all went away and they haven't come back. So there's a massive demographic crisis, and so there's a sort of they have a lot of there's a lot of symbolism. So, and the eggs are also, yeah, eggs also in a sort of way, like relationship wise, mother daughter, this all comes into play. I don't want to well, it's not out in English yet, but maybe some of the listeners read it in German, then don't want to give everything away.
I'm sure they will. I hope they will. I very much enjoyed it, and it did resonate with me, and I'm sure will do with other people as well. So maybe then just the last question that gets us maybe from the book to the big question about sort of where East Germany fits in. So your protagonist Kathleen in the book loves the English for what she calls their Geschichtsbewusstsein, so their like sort of consciousness of their own history. In Britain, I often get the opposite. So people in Britain say Germany is very good at this and thinking about its own history and dealing with it. As someone who's lived between both of these worlds, where do you see the main differences? So in what way do people in Britain think differently about their history compared to Germany and its history?
Well, the big difference is that I think you probably said that as well, like that there was this basically yeah, there's a direct line from the Magna Carta in Britain till today. So I mean, the oldest democracy in the world, like no radical changes, no dictatorships. I mean, a lot of dark times also in Britain, but this sort of long stretch of democracy is like something that Germany, and also like as a national identity, much longer. There's a much longer history in Britain than in Germany, with all its problems and divisions, of course. And Kathleen sort of finds herself. She finds it like a sort of like a synopsis of all her experiences, like something that sort of she finds it easier to fit in there than in Germany, with a very sort of conflicted history between East and West. Yeah.
And that conflicted history, I think, has led to a situation where even today you have young East Germans growing up and were basically people who were born after 1990 who still have a sort of East German identity. I mean, in the book you mention a character, Nadine, who's the same age as the protagonist, but sort of stayed behind and was her childhood friend and stayed in the village. And she is also walking around at some point with the sort of, I think it was a T-shirt or a jumper or something that said East Germany on it or Ostdeutschland on it. So this identity it strikes me as something quite interesting that is still there even amongst younger people as well. So do you think with Germany having to deal with the fact that it has this divided past, both more recently and previously as well, will there always be an East German identity, or do you think that will sort of wash out over time? And is it even a bad thing if it doesn't? I mean, it seems to, it's one of the hallmarks, isn't it, when people say has unification worked? What they mean is there no East Germany anymore, and have people adapted to this kind of idea of the normal
Have
Germany
they
finally?
arrived? Have they
Yeah,
arrived?
that's indeed the phrase that is often used. So
Yeah.
is that going to be a thing, do you think, over time, or do you think it'll die out? And if it doesn't, is that really such a bad thing?
I think this sort of wearing T-shirts that say Ostdeutschland, I mean, that is a relatively new thing, like under sort of backlash of all this belittling, being overlooked. It's like basically, okay, you make us. I mean, no one called themselves East German in 1990. This is like it was like a projection. One has been called East German, and then okay, we've been called East German the whole time. Then let's make it ours. Like a sort of mechanism that is also in other cultures, like typical. You can see that in other cultures and Muslim cultures or so, that you sort of turn it around and become this sort of proud with a little bit of like cheekiness also. And there's a lot of that now, especially in football. You have like these shouts, Ostdeutschland. And some of it is innocent and others maybe is also exploited by the neo-Nazis. So one has to be careful there. I mean, I think the debate has already changed, and it will change even more the more this generation that has been an adult during the Cold War is like aging and dying out. Because even if younger people have like this East German identity, it's less fraud, there are less personal injuries as deep and impactful as in the 90s. I mean, and there are more and more experiences also together, you know, the pandemic, the Ukraine war, the Israel Gaza war, all the current problems is being overridden. So when I look at my children, I mean, they are 10 and 7, and for them it's just a story that their mom constantly is telling. And it's it's just something that they don't I mean, they will know about it, and yeah, but it won't be so tricky. But what I think will persist are the differences between East and West, like between North and South England, because the economic situation is so different. Like all the big companies that are yeah, the big companies are all based in West Germany. If you want to have a classic managerial career and earn lots of money, you have to go to West Germany. Okay, there's Tesla now in Brandenburg, but I mean, yeah, that's just one company, and how long they're gonna last, one doesn't know. I mean, Elon Musk is talking about sacking people. So, but for many, many years there was nothing, and also it's a very rural area. There are none of these sort of big city areas like in North Rhine-Westphalia, which many Brits know. There's nothing like that. There are a few big cities, but most of it is rural. We have this demographic problem, like lots and lots of old people. So it will be continuing, like, yeah, different from West Germany. But the East Germany will, but these problems exist in many other countries. They exist in France, they exist in Britain, they exist in Italy, with all the political consequences that it carries. That's why East Germany is also often like seen as this vanguard for political changes. So when what happens there can also happen in other sparsely over-aged populated areas. Yeah.
Well, on that cheery note, let's finish there. Thank you so much, Sabine, for coming on the Zeitgeist podcast to speak about your experiences and your books and your work. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you for your interest. Thank you so much.
Well, goodbye for now, dear listeners. And for more German thoughts and themes, do visit my accompanying blog, Zeitgeist, as well. Until then, cheerio.